Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and this was a weird game, man. This one was villains versus villains. Specifically, it was robots versus Skrulls. And this game session was so frustrating. Like everything kept going wrong. The ending of it was awesome. We loved the ending. The players had a very strong reaction to the end of the game, but everything leading up to that was grueling. And it was so bad that at one point I actually quit running it in one game system. I called an intermission for about 45 minutes and I converted all of the characters over from one game system to another. And then we actually finished it in that game system. And off the top of my head, I can't remember ever doing that before. But that was how badly things seemed to be going, as I was like, I think it's unrunnable the way we're doing it. At any rate, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I feel like the best place to start is to say that there's different ways that I tackle the process as a game master of coming up with new adventures. One of those things that I do is I will look at the thumbnails that I have on YouTube because each thumbnail for my videos reminds me of an adventure that I ran. And sometimes I'll look for like a dangling plot thread that I accidentally abandoned. And I'll go, oh, we need to do something with that. We need to say, hey, whatever happened to that guy or, whatever. Sometimes I will look for apparent contradictions. And then I will run a new game that tries to explain that away, right? And so specifically, I was looking at, first of all, we had a shortage of villains in the modern day. And I felt like that needed addressed, that somehow we needed villains to come back, and I wasn't quite sure how to do that. And by the way, real quick, the reason for that is if you have enough characters in your game world, whether it's the Punisher or Lobo or whoever, that they're not a fan of knockout damage only, right? If they have a more permanent solution for the villains, I feel like if your campaign runs long enough, you run out of classic villains after a while, right? And we did. So, anyways, that was a problem. I needed villains. And then the other thing that I saw was that back in the 60s and 70s, I ran the Skrull like they were totally bad, right? They were villains through and through. And then you get to a point in our timeline around the year 2010, and now we are seeing heroic Skrull. And I thought that it's not exactly a contradiction, but it's a big enough change. I felt like maybe I should address that a little bit more while also solving my villain shortage, right? So I said that in the modern day, in 2025, there is a Skrull civil war taking place, and that the throne of the Skrull Empire is very coveted, and that through the years, various rulers are overthrown, and a new person takes the throne. And in the past, what we were basically seeing was bad guys overthrowing other bad guys. And so the Skrull Empire had stayed bad for a long time, right? And then you get to the 21st century, and all of a sudden, our version of a Skrull named Varanki, she is, in our game world, she's like lawful good. And she overthrows there's a whole line of guys named Doric. It's like Doric the first, Doric the second, Doric the third. that is sort of a bloodline of emperors. She overthrew one of the Dorics, and Varanki became empress of the Skrull Empire, and she was having them be good. And so we saw a bunch of them go to Earth. And by the way, back in the day, the Skrulls had the technology to create the first Super Skrull. And he had the abilities of the Fantastic Four. So, he had a body of orange rock, like the Thing. It could catch fire, like the Human Torch. It could stretch, like Mr. Fantastic. It could turn invisible, like Sue could. And then later, we saw another Super Skrull, and he had the abilities of the Avengers. And again, we limited it to only four characters in terms of what he could biologically do. Like the strength of the Hulk, for instance, is not a gadget. You know what I mean? That would be a biological trait that this character has on his character sheet. But then anybody who had gadgets, like say Tony Stark, of course, has the Iron Man armor. The armor is a gadget. So we said that did not count against his four character limit, that he could biologically have these other abilities, like the strength of the Hulk or the shrinking of Hank Pym, or whatever. But then on top of that, the fifth character we bring in is Iron Man in the form of the armor, and the sixth character that we bring in is Thor in the form of Thor's hammer. And we were saying that the Skrull had the technology all the way back then in like the Bronze Age to perfectly recreate everything that Mjolnir does. And for anyone familiar with older Marvel stuff, because I know a lot of listeners are going to be more familiar with like the newer movies, where Thor is kind of always Thor. But back in the day, Thor was Dr. Donald Blake. And he had a walking stick, and he'd tap it on the ground, and then it would transform into the hammer. And then Blake himself would transform into Thor, and then he had powers. And they were saying, his strength goes up this many column shifts, his endurance or his body, that goes up X number of column shifts. So we were applying that to this Avengers Super Skrull, right? And by the way, the Skrull's ability to perfectly replicate through technology the artifacts of the Asgardians is going to come up later. So put a pin in that. But at any rate, by the time you get to around 2010, the Skrull now can mass produce the Super Skrull technology, and we see all these like lawful good Skrull, sort of like missionaries basically to Earth, who all have the abilities of various characters. And it was usually an eclectic blend of stuff. So someone might be a mixture of like Black Bolt and Doctor Strange and Hercules and I don't know, Electro or something. You know what I mean? Um and we ran a whole campaign of that at one point where I was letting the players just pick four Marvel characters, and then they would have their guy then. And so that was pretty cool. But I was wondering sort of, where are the bad ones? If we had all these bad guys before, where are they at? Surely they're not just rolling over and taking this. So we came up with the idea that there was a rebellion against the throne. And that whereas the good Skrulls, all of their gear is like shiny and new and well maintained, and they had tremendous resources on their side because they had kind of the funding of the empire to back up everything they were doing. We then said that the rebels are the bad guys. Their equipment is sort of dirty and old and malfunctioning, and so on and so forth, because they just can't scrape together the resources to do any better than that, right? But we had a story where the rebels basically break into the facility where they make the super scrolls, right? And they steal some equipment, and then they have a hideout somewhere where they've cobbled together their own version, kind of a pirated version, if you will, of this technology. But because they're so limited in scope and all of that, they can only give a character the powers of a single guy. And so we had an adventure then where there was a Skrull who went to Earth, and he was the new chameleon, as in the Spider-Man villain, the chameleon. And he fought Spider-Man. And sort of the twist in that story is that he didn't actually have the powers of the chameleon, because the chameleon's a shapeshifter and all the Skrulls are shapeshifters, right? He was actually using his natural Skrull abilities to be a shapeshifter. The character whose powers he had was Spider-Man. So it was a good fight, right? It was a cool adventure. I liked how that one played out. But I decided to follow that up, and we wanted to explore this idea of a Skrull civil war even more, and that was going to solve our villain shortage. That I was going to introduce more and more, we're going to have a Skrull Thanos and a Skrull, whatever. And I was going to run a lot of future games with Skrull versions of characters. So then the thing that happened out of game is one of our players, Brad, he's our newest player. He's lived in the area now for about 6 months. He was looking for a gaming group, found us. Where he used to live, the United Way sponsored this thing that's kind of like the Big Brothers, Big Sisters agency kind of thing, where it was an after school role playing club where Brad ran that, and he ran Dungeons and Dragons for kids after school. And it was at a local pizza place a couple hours south of where I live now. And at any rate, the school bus would drop kids off there at the pizza place after school, and they would just play D&D until their parents got off work at 6 o'clock or whatever, and would show up and pick up the kids and take them home. And so that was accomplishing a lot of really good things. It got kids off the street. Um, it was teaching them, teamwork and all the benefits from role playing, of course. It was feeding a lot of kids who maybe didn't have a great situation at home, right? So giving a kid a meal is good. You get the idea, right? Like on a lot of levels, that's a good thing. So he's talking about running that here, and that I would be, I mean, and this is subject to change, nothing's set in stone, of course, but that I would be running a thing for these kids that right now sounds like it might be an Avengers campaign, but we're not sure yet. But it would be at a local pizza place after school on like a Thursday or Friday night. So I did a similar thing about 20 years ago in my hometown, where when school let out at 3 o'clock, um, the kids would be taken to church, and then they let us use their basement. And I was running a Justice League campaign at the time. And what I noticed was that, if the kid goes home to his mom and she's like, "What did you do in like role playing club today?" And he's like, "Well, we, whatever, we fought Darkseid, and Billy beat him to death with, you know, such and such a thing or whatever." A lot of times the parents are not thrilled when they hear that, right? So conversely, if little Billy goes home and the mom says, "What did you do today?" And he's like, "Well, I was Colossus and we fought a sentinel and we smashed a robot, now the mom doesn't mind. Right. So I started thinking as soon as Brad was like, we're going to run this thing for kids, I was like, we should have it be robots for sure. Like I should not be having bludgeon organic characters to death. You know what I mean? Um, so I decided to take a look at the old Marvel superheroes game by TSR, and they had robots throughout it. And I thought that would be a neat kind of a dangling plot hook thing to bring back whatever happened to these robots. So there was a Magneto robot built by Sentinels at one point. It had the same motivation that Magneto had. Um, and it had a self-repairing quality. So in that module, they say that this was a robot from years later, in the 60s or whatever, and then the 80s it revived and it was up and running again. And I thought, well, that'd be cool. Let's just do that same thing again. Let's have it revive. And I said it went to Murder World. And among other things, Murder World is famous for the machinery that can create robotic duplicates of existing characters. So first of all, the Magneto robot got repaired by this machinery, which it was able to control. It kind of has machine control, this specific character. Um, but then on top of that, it was like, now build me the Masters of Evil. Because before it had robotic duplicates of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And I thought, well, they were defeated. Maybe it would see that as not the solution, right? So we brought in robot versions of the Masters of Evil. One of them was a robotic version of Dr. Octopus. It reacquired the Octodroid, which is another robot from a classic Marvel module, so on and so forth, right? And I liked that. I thought, no, this is great. We're just kind of setting up the chess pieces in a way for that campaign that I'm going to run for those kids. And then they're going to be able to be Avengers and they're going to be able to fight robot versions of classic Marvel villains without making their parents mad when they go home and tell their parents what they did that day, right? But what occurred to me because of my brain tumor making me forgetful is I'd kind of forgotten about the Skrulls. And I took a step back, so I'm looking at my page on YouTube and the thumbnails and stuff, and I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of did the same thing twice. I have two completely different groups of imposter supervillains. And I was like, man, I should address that somehow. If nothing else, let's hang a lantern on it, but like somehow I need to address it. So I came up with this game where I was like, it would be cool is there's going to be these fake because we set up Avengers West Coast and Avengers East Coast. And one of the reasons for that, in case it wasn't obvious to those that watched those videos, is I broke down the Avengers based on how much damage they do. So the heavy hitters like Iron Man were on the West Coast, and the street level characters that are more like, Black Widow and Hawkeye and, that kind of thing, more like human guys with martial arts and stuff like that, they were on the East Coast. So, so at any rate, we had sort of just kind of reintroduced the idea of there being West Coast Avengers, which is, I think, what the kids would be playing. And so we'd been doing a story out in California with Murder World and the Murder World robots and everything. And I thought, it'd be cool is the Skrull should show up and they see somebody who looks like Magneto, for instance, and a Skrull guy who, looks like, I don't know, Electro or someone should try to go report into the wrong Magneto, right? That they mistake robot Magneto for Skrull Magneto. And I liked that idea of these two groups of villains bump into each other accidentally and come to blows because of course they're not going to work together, right? The robots do not at all have the same motivation that the Skrulls do. So that was the setup for this adventure, and it becomes a massive brawl, right? And so to run this, I did not want to convert a million Marvel characters over into DC Hero stats. And like I talked to Vince a little bit before I was running this, and he and I both play DC Heroes and Marvel superheroes. We both play DC way more. I know a lot of people have preference in terms of the characters, where a lot of people like Marvel characters more than DC characters. But as far as the system itself, as far as the game mechanics, I feel like if you play both systems, most people are probably going to agree that even if they like the Marvel characters more, they like the DC game mechanics more, right? That the AP system is just really cool. So I normally run stuff in DC because of that. I'm rusty at running things in the Marvel system. It's not that I can't, it's just sometimes I need a refresher on game day of like, wait, how do you do this? How do you do that? And then I remember and I'm like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's do that. But I came up with this idea because the Marvel game came out in 1984 and the DC game came out a year later. And personally, and I'm sure the game designers would deny this because nobody wants to open the door to like a potential lawsuit or anything. But I strongly think that the DC game took a look at Marvel, took what they were doing, and then made changes, which, in my humble opinion, and obviously your mileage may vary, but in my humble opinion, I think they were improvements mathematically. But I think that the two game systems are so close in terms of the starting point there that I thought, you know what? I I want to run Marvel character sheets using the DC tables, and I think it's going to work. And so I came up with the table that you're looking at right now, the channel art. And it's just instead of saying, this guy has, let's say, archery of 8 APs and he's trying to shoot this other guy, and this guy has an agility of 8 APs or whatever, and therefore he needs to roll an 11 or better on 2d10 in order to hit. Instead of doing that, we were saying, okay, what if it's like you have remarkable archery and he has remarkable agility, and therefore you need to roll an 11 or better to hit, right? And so that's how we started this game. And that way I didn't have to make any character sheets. We could just use the Marvel character sheets. And then of course, if somebody had, say, um, I don't know, class 1000 strength or something like that, that would do 1,000 points of damage then, and we would base it on, well, how many hit points does does your character have in the Marvel system? So sort of that resolution part of it was more Marvel than DC, but hopefully people familiar with both systems get what I'm saying, and I'm like, I think this is going to work. But what threw us off was this. First of all, my son, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all, hopefully he would agree with me, because he has autism, a lot of his mannerisms and just the way he thinks and stuff like that, he puts me in mind of a robot a lot. He kind of speaks in monotone a lot of the time, and some of his speech patterns remind me of Data from Star Trek The Next Generation. And I love my son. That's by no means an insult. But I told him kind of before we even sat down to play, I said, I'd really like you to be the robot team. I think you're the guy for that, you know. And he agreed. And he's like, that's great. And so he chose a Doom bot from the old Marvel superheroes game, in keeping with that theme that we were taking a lot of old robots from that game system and we were saying, where are they now kind of thing. So he decided to play a Doom bot. So that's a robot that looks like Dr. Doom. And then on the other side, Brad was going to play a Skrull. And I asked him who he wanted to be. And when he got back to me, he said he wanted to be Loki. And I was like, that's interesting. That's fine. And again, that comes back to that thing of the Skrulls have the perfect ability to replicate all things Asgardian, right? Through science and technology. So he's Skrull Loki. And I'm like, that's fine, that's cool. And so these two fight then. And it was so frustrating because what I realized in that moment, and I just dropped the ball in the lead up to all this, that I didn't play test it a little ahead of time or whatever. I just kind of, oftentimes, I will have blind faith that things are going to work out, and as was the case in this game. So, what I think the problem is that I think that the Marvel game designers, if not the Marvel writers themselves, like Stan Lee probably, I'm guessing that Stan Lee didn't really want Doctor Doom to just get stomped and get thrown in jail, right? That doesn't sound very Doctor Doom. So therefore, Doctor Doom has all these defenses. And I love Doctor Doom. He's one of my favorite villains of all time. So don't take this the wrong way. On paper though, Doctor Doom does not have a lot going on in terms of his offensive capabilities. And I'm not insulting him. Again, I love Doom. But the writer doesn't want Doom to just effortlessly kill the hero, right? So that part of it, I think, is dialed down while they want them to get away and be a really interesting, cool, reoccurring villain. So then the defense is really high. Well, so then Loki was the same way, right? And so what that means is when these two fight, their ability to hurt the other one is like relatively low, but their ability to take damage is really high. It's just like through the roof for both of them. So this fight was so drawn out. And every time you would attack, it wasn't just like, okay, so it's like my strength versus this guy's body, and it's just a punch, like you might get with, say, Batman and the Joker or something like that, right? In this case, it was like I punch him, but then he's got skin armor, which means that he himself is just tough, right? Like let's say we're talking about the Doombot. It's made of metal. Metal is tough. It resists at this level. But then on top of it, it was stuff like, and there's like energy absorption. That is, if you attack with any kind of a ranged energy-based weapon, it's just sucking up that energy instead of being hurt by it. And then on top of that, there's like a force field, right? It was layer after layer after layer of defense, and a lot of their offensive ability was like a 12 AP attack. You know what I mean? And then the defensive abilities would be like 40 APs or 45 APs of like, well, here's my body. And then on top of that, we had skin armor. And then on top of that, we had this other thing. So the fight lasted for hours. We were doing this for hours, getting nowhere. And then I'm like looking at this table that I came up with where we're trying to play DC heroes with Marvel character sheets, and I told everybody, I said I think this is not working. By the way, here's another problem is I've mentioned before on the podcast I have a brain tumor. I've mentioned it makes me forgetful. I don't know though if I've mentioned focus. Um it's really hard for me to like pay attention later in the day. I don't know why, but just the way it works for me is when I wake up in the morning, I have like peak clarity, and like that is like the best I'm going to be at concentrating all day long. So I actually like to run a game at noon or something like that, so that the first few hours of the day is prep time as a GM before we actually play. Run the game at noon, be done maybe around 3 o'clock or something, and then I watch TV or whatever. I kind of chill out for the rest of the day. But so on this day, it's like we had stuff going on earlier in the day. I think Brad had a D&D game session that afternoon, and then after that, I think it was like I think I had to run an errand, and I don't know, but all this stuff got in the way, so we didn't start playing until night. And so like my brain was already kind of compromised, and then I'm trying to do this kind of experimental table thing that wasn't working, and then on top of that is like the way these guys are built. So I shut it all down, and I'm like, I am so sorry, guys. Let's take an intermission. I'm going to just convert everybody's character into DC heroes, and then we're going to come back at it again. So we were keeping the continuity of the fight so far, which was essentially Skrull Loki versus a Doombot accomplishing nothing. There was a lot of smack talk, by the way, but they were accomplishing nothing. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. So I convert all the sheets over, which took, I think, 45 minutes. Because here's the other thing that kind of made it complicated was on Loki's character. And by the way, in the Marvel superhero stuff by TSR, and again, I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus. I love all of this stuff. But for whatever reason, some of the famous villains, their stats vary depending on, are you finding Loki in the main thing of character sheets for the game? Are you finding him in like an Avengers module? Are you finding him in a handbook about Asgard, telling you everything you need to know about that? He'd have different stuff, right? But in one of those write-ups, he had the ability to turn into any other creature from Asgard. So Brad says he wants to turn into the World Serpent or the Midgard Serpent, whatever it's called. And I'm like, okay. And I was like, let me take a look at the rules quick. I did. Seemed, like he was allowed to. So it's like, okay, cool, you do. Now we need stats for that. So, and not only is it that, but it's that with the mind of Loki, right? So when we take that intermission, first I have to make a Loki character sheet to see how many APs of intelligence he has, APs of willpower and mind, and all that. So that took me 15 minutes, and then it took me 15 minutes to make the Midgard Serpent with the abilities Loki has. So I did that. Then I made the Doombot, and that took me about 15 minutes. So then I called the guys back, and they were all eating supper at that point. And I said, okay, I'm done making character sheets. And then my son is like, well, like my food just came out and of the oven, and I want to eat that before we play. And he's such a slow eater. I love him, but he's such a slow eater. You could give him a grape and he'll get back to you in an hour at any rate. Uh, so finally we play, and it's the same thing. And they're attacking each other and like they're not getting anywhere. And it was so frustrating. And and then in the smack talk, some really interesting stuff came out. So both of them decided that their character thinks they are the original. And there's precedent for this. So in the case of um Doombots, we have seen in classic Marvel comics Doombots that for whatever reason think they're the real Doom. And then they seem to die, and that might have been a writer who actually was intending to kill off the real Doctor Doom, and then Stan or some other writer comes in later and says, no, 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 that was just a Doombot. The real Doctor Doom is fine. You're never taking down the real Doom. So this Doombot thinks it's the real Doom. And so one of his motivations is he's convinced that his mother is in hell, and they have a note about that on the character sheet for Doctor Doom. And I think they don't call it hell by name. They call it the realm of Mephisto or something, but whatever, tomato, tomato. So, so that's one of his motivations is he wants to go there. And so in the Marvel Superheroes game, they give Thor's hammer dimension travel between realms so that Thor can go back and forth from Earth to Asgard, right? And so this is the direction the Doombot starts thinking in is I need to get a hold of Thor's hammer to go rescue my mom from hell. And I thought that's very interesting. And then we were also kind of like, what happens if he goes there and that's where the real Doom is? Because of how much time has passed in our game, right? Because the original Doom we mentioned was actually kicking around in World War II. He was helping the Axis powers back then. And I thought, well, I like the direction that's going in, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On the Skrull Loki's end, his thing was and hopefully Brad listens to this and corrects me if I'm wrong, as always. But if I remember correctly, the way he kind of framed it was that because he had the powers of a god, he's like basically anybody with godlike powers is a god. So the Skrull had seen it as like I am a god now. I have ascended to godhood. And and so I am actually going to like I'm not really I don't want to just be a warrior in the Skrull army anymore, right? Like I'm beyond that. I want to take over. I have this grander ambition. And and I mean this in the best way possible. That reminded me a lot of Starscream from Transformers, how he wants to overthrow Megatron and he wants to be the leader of the Decepticons, right? So I thought, well, that's cool. We got some really cool stuff happening here. So Skrull Loki turns into the Midgard serpent, and by the way, he at one point he said something about like wrapping around the world, kind of like a boa constrictor. And so I just start thinking like imagine you had like a snake isn't quite the right word, but I'm going to use that word anyway since he's got a long body and stuff. But just imagine for a minute if you had a snake so big it was wrapped around a planet like that is going to destroy cities, right? Like what happens to New York if there's just like a gigantic snake belly grinding against the whole city? It's just going to turn buildings to dust on a global scale. I'm like, that would be awful. And so I said, well, hold up a minute. Let me check something out. And I told him, I said, I know that I think Brad is probably more familiar with like actual Norse mythology, because he's like a big fantasy guy. Um, I said, like the Marvel versions are always a little wrong when it comes to Norse mythology. Like in Norse mythology, Thor had a beard, and then the classic Thor was clean shaven. And Thor had red hair, and classic Thor had blonde hair, and so on and so forth. And so I said, let's hold on, let me look up what is the Midgard serpent like in Marvel Comics, though, right? And something that weirded me out was I saw one panel where Thor was fighting it, and it was literally just like the size of a boa constrictor. That was the smallest I saw it. And I was like, what? Like, that's kind of weird. And then there was another one where I saw it and it was the size of a planet. And so we were like, okay, well, is this thing kind of like a snake, but it has like the growing power? Does it have growth on its character sheet? And it didn't, but it had illusion. And then it says something about the illusion power is limited to like the horizon line. And I thought that's interesting. I think the Marvel version of this thing is not so big it wraps around the world. Um, it's a smaller thing, creating the illusion that it's a bigger thing. And we couldn't find any more information about that on the spot, so that was my ruling in the game. I'm sure there's going to be someone in the comments section saying, "Hey, you did it wrong." Fair enough. If nothing else, that's why we say our adventures take place on Earth K rather than Earth 616. Blame it on the how the different dimensions are variants. There's little things different here and there in the various continuities. So on Earth K, we established that the Midgard serpent is significantly smaller and it pretends that it's bigger. We still, though, said that it was big enough that it was wrapped around, it was coiled around Doom. And I think we said it was like as big around as a school bus, is what we ended up going with. So when it opened its mouth was like 10 feet tall or whatever. But so it's coiled around Doom and it starts to crush him in like a constrictor attack. And now that we're doing it in DC, now people are rolling doubles. So at one point, I don't have the information in front of me right now to know exactly what it was. But at one point, Brad rolled like double tens, double tens, double tens, double tens, that kind of thing. And so he finally did some damage to Doom. And he takes Doom's body from, I don't know, 12 or something like that down to like a 4. It's probably not exact, but it gives you like a ballpark idea of how much the Doombot is hurting, right? And so then my son had come up with this kind of, when all else fails, he had a thing he wanted to do, which was personality transfer. And we had decided, by the way, and I need to reference GURPS for a minute because this is going to confuse a lot of people. I know it will. GURPS had this idea that I thought was kind of a cool idea, and different role playing games handle this differently. But the way GURPS handled it was, if you were playing a game where, let's say, you had wizards, but they were in the modern world, right? The way GURPS handled it was you had to train to like pronounce the words perfectly. So if you cast a spell, if you say abracadabra or whatever, and that is going to cast, say, magic missile at an enemy, right? The idea was to do wizard school or whatever to learn how to say it just perfectly. And that there was something subtle about that when other people hear you and they try to repeat it, if they haven't gone to school and invested time in it and raised that skill to the needed degree, they're saying it just wrong enough that nothing happens, right? But, and GURP specifies this, if you record their voice on like a tape recorder and they cast the spell and then you play it back, the tape recorder casts the spell then, because the tape recorder perfectly reproduced the sound, is how GURPS handles that, which I always thought was interesting. And back in some games we had in high school, we did have a character who did exactly that. And then he would just hit play and then rewind and play and rewind and play. And he was just had an endless amount of magic missiles he was shooting at people, right? Fun stuff. I know it's not for everybody. There's a lot of people that wouldn't run their game that way, and that's fine. I respect your preference. We liked it though. We thought it was cool. At any rate, going back to the Doombot that thinks he's Doom, we decided he could cast Doom spells. He had heard Doom do all of that. He has that robotic precision where he can perfectly repeat the words, so on and so forth, right? So even though he was a robot, he had sorcery and he was casting the same spells as Doom. So in other words, my son is using a Doctor Doom character sheet so that he had the best chance possible at having a fair fight with Loki. Excuse me, the Loki Skrull. You know what I mean? At any rate, so the Doombot then has a spell on his character sheet that is personality transfer. So he does it. And it's kind of like that old movie Freaky Friday with like Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis, which was a remake of an old, I want to say 1960s Disney version of the same thing, but it's the mom and the daughter switch minds, right? And so now it's the mind of Lindsay Lohan is in Jamie Lee Curtis, and she's like, screams and says, "I'm old," right? Same idea. All of a sudden, the mind of the Loki Skrull is inside the body of the Doombot with not a lot of hit points left, right? The mind of the Doombot, who thinks he's the real Doctor Doom, is now in the organic body of the Loki Skrull, which is pretending to be the Midgard serpent, or he had shapeshifted into the Midgard serpent. And before the game, my son was asking me for pointers on how to play Doctor Doom. And we talked about it for maybe 20 minutes. And I I told him what my take on Doom was, and I thought Doom was very ego centric. Um you the listener are probably already familiar with Doctor Doom, so I don't need to get too into it. But so he's already annoyed. And like he had kind of told me before we even played that was his, if all else fails, that was his plan, was to switch bodies. And he didn't want to because he thought of his own body as superior. And he thought his pride would keep him from wanting to do that. But if all else failed, he would do that, right? So the Doombot is getting ready to get crushed, and he actually does the body swap. And so then Brad sees that and he's like, well, I want to access whatever part of the robot does that, and I want my body back. And we're like, it's not part of the robot, it's a spell. And that knowledge is in the mind of the Doombot, which is now in your body. He could do it again. You cannot. And Brad was a very good sport about that. A lot of people would get mad. I've had players in the past that'll be angry and, whatever, get up from the game table and, so on and so forth, have a little tantrum. Kudos to Brad for not doing any of that. He handled it like a champ, and he's like, that's cool, man. That's a cool move that Tor did. And so, but before he gets crushed, he says, I want to spend my automatic action just talking. And I'm going to tell Doom what a coward he is. And he's like, really? He's like, Doom is so inferior, he has to resort to stealing my superior body or whatever. And like, man, I'm not doing it justice now. But he said it, and everybody playing was like, oh, like there was this big reaction, like, oh my God. And it was just like the words were perfectly crafted to irritate Doom the most. You know what I mean? Where he was like, oh, like he was so mad. And he sort of freezes up for a minute, like, should I switch back and try to win? And he decides that, like, because this game has been so long and it is so hard for these guys to hurt each other, he's like, I don't think I can. And it's just eating him alive. He hates it so much. And so it becomes the turn of the Doombot that is in the body of the Skrull version of Loki, which is shapeshifted into the Midgard serpent. And he constricts more and he crushes his opponent. So the mind of the Doombot in the body of Loki wins, right? And Brad is like, that's cool, man. That's cool. And I said something to Brad. I said, if you want, we can say that the Skrull guy you were playing in this adventure has like a brother. We're doing the classic Dungeons and Dragons thing of the brother will want to avenge his brother. And he's like, "Yeah, let's for sure do that. I want to play again. Like I kind of want to rematch, and then maybe it'll be like Midgard Serpent versus Midgard Serpent or whatever." But and I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, that's totally cool. We're gonna do more of this, and you'll get to do that, and this isn't over yet." And he's like, "Awesome." And then I'm like, "So, Tor, what do you want to do?" And so then he's like, "Well, these guys have the ability to replicate this, the Asgardian technology. I want a Thor's hammer, a Mjolnir of my own. And by the way, the Skrull Mjolnirs don't care at all what your alignment is. So you can be chaotic evil and still pick it up off the ground, right? Um, because they were made back in the Bronze Age when all the Skrull were evil, right? So it would do them no good to make a weapon that they themselves could not use. Point being, he's like, so my plan now is I need to go get my hands on that. So he shapeshifts into Skrull Loki. He goes to where the other Skrull are, and by now they have defeated these robots, right? And by the way, Murder World will just build more robots. Like, that's fine. There's still going to be more robots in future games. But for now, the robots are defeated because the robots were limited. Like, they could only be a certain list of characters, they were only the Masters of Evil, right? And so someone who's not one of the Masters of Evil is Thanos. The Skrull are not limited by a certain character roster. They can be anybody. So there is a Skrull Thanos. And so he was tearing apart like the robot Dr. Octopus and stuff like that. Hopefully that makes sense. As always, if it doesn't, ask me in the comments section and I will do my best to clarify. Um, but so at the epilogue of the game, the who looks like the Skrull Loki reports into the others and is playing it cool, and they have no reason to think it's not him. And so he just states, I'm going to go to the Skrull homeworld. I'm going to get a hammer at the very least. Then I'm going to try to open a portal to hell, and I'm going to get my mom's soul. But he says, not only that, I want to see if the Skrulls have the ability to make Skrull Infinity Gems, Skrull Cosmic Cubes, so on and so forth, right? And so he's going to play it cool for like a while and arm up, and he wants to conquer the universe. And that was kind of the note that we left on, and we thought this sounds great, you know. Also, I feel like it's often really, really hard to run a villain's campaign, but this game went well. I really liked how this game went. And then after the game, we were talking about how we all kind of agreed that the soul of the real Doctor Doom in my game world would for sure be in hell, right? In Mephisto's realm. And we were like, what would be wild is, first of all, what does a Doombot do when it realizes he's not the real Doom? We don't even know what the answer is to that. If you guys have input on that, that would be really useful to us. Say that in the comments. What do you think would happen if the Doombot goes to hell and finds out he's not the real Doctor Doom? But then follow up was someone said, you have this villain shortage. What if we did a jailbreak adventure from hell? And what if it's the real villains all make a comeback? And so all these actual villains from Marvel and DC, by the way, all come back to Earth K. They all want to, rule the world and stuff like that. We thought that sounded really cool. And it's the 40th anniversary of the game. We thought that might be this year's crisis then, because we do some kind of a crisis every year. And I thought that sounds really cool. So that is the note that we end this on. I hope that you enjoyed hearing about all of this insanity. If so, as always, we would love it if you chose to support the channel by smashing the like button. leaving a comment, all that jazz, right? And from everybody here associated with the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth, we hope you guys have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.